The millionaire's son had never spoken until the nanny did the impossible. The rain in Seattle that day seemed determined to empty the entire sky onto the cold, glistening streets. Brian Cole pulled his collar up, clutching his soaked leather briefcase as he strode quickly through the marble-tiled hallway of the penthouse. He was used to the one sound that always greeted him at home, the rain drumming against the glass and the heavy silence filling every room. Oliver, his 5-year-old son, had not spoken a single word since the day his mother was gone. The doctors said every function was perfectly normal, but something inside him had sealed shut. For 2 years, this house had been like a museum of silence, its walls holding more than just the absence of sound. They held grief and distance. But today was different. The moment he opened the door, Brian heard something so foreign that his heart stalled. Laughter. Not the kind that was polite or forced, but a sound so pure it spilled into the air in waves, like tiny bells rolling across a wooden floor. And alongside it, a woman's voice, warm, slightly husky, singing a song about airplanes and the sky. Brian walked slowly toward the living room, afraid that one wrong move might shatter it all like an illusion. And then he saw them. Oliver lay on the arched legs of Sophia Reyes, the new housekeeper who had arrived less than 3 weeks ago. Her legs holding him high, steady, as if he were flying. Sophia's arms stretched wide, her voice rich with imagery. We're flying through the white clouds, reaching for the blue sky. Oliver wasn't speaking, but his lips moved with the melody, releasing small, tentative hums, sounds Brian hadn't heard in 2 years. His eyes sparkled, his cheeks flushed with laughter, his small hands patting at the air as if cutting through the wind. Brian froze in the doorway. The suit jacket he'd worn since morning was damp and cold from the rain, but every sensation on his skin faded away. All that remained was the pounding of his heart and the scene before him. He had paid the finest specialists, taken his son everywhere in search of a way to help him speak, but no one had ever drawn such joyful sounds from Oliver. And now it was happening, on the bare feet of a woman he hardly knew. Sophia gently lowered Oliver, settling him onto her stomach, both still laughing. She hadn't noticed Brian standing there, only kept brushing the boy's messy hair back and humming the last line of the song. And in that moment, Brian realized the house no longer felt heavy. It breathed, and so did he. Sophia finally noticed Brian standing in the doorway. She didn't flinch or scramble to her feet like other housekeepers might have. Instead, she simply looked up, offered a soft smile, and said, "You're home." Her voice was calm and steady, as if being caught playing airplane with her employer's son was the most natural thing in the world. Oliver still lay across her stomach, his hands tracing invisible circles in the air. Brian set his briefcase down on the long couch and stepped closer. He sat on the floor, his eyes never leaving his son. The boy glanced briefly at Brian, then quickly returned to his game, lips still shaping those small, humming sounds. "Is he always like this with you?" Brian asked, his tone a mix of wonder and disbelief. Sophia shook her head gently. "No, this is the first time, but we play together every day." Brian glanced at her, searching for an explanation. Sophia smiled, but didn't rush to answer. She extended her hands, letting Oliver sit up on his own, then eased him down onto the rug. No holding, no guiding, just letting him walk to the corner to fetch a box of crayons. "I'm not trying to make him talk," she said slowly, her gaze still following Oliver. "I'm just listening to him in his own way." The words were simple, yet they seemed to press against an empty space inside Brian. For 2 years, he had sought answers in medical reports, charts, and diagnoses. He had never once considered. Simply sitting down and listening. Oliver sat on the floor, scribbling on a sheet of paper. Each stroke of the crayon was bold, patches of blue and yellow spreading like the sky he had just flown through with Sophia. Brian crouched down beside him. Oliver looked up briefly, then pushed the box of crayons toward him, an unspoken but unmistakable invitation. Brian picked up a crayon and drew a cloud beside the yellow circle Oliver had colored in. The boy studied it for a moment, then added a few lines, small wings like tiny birds. From across the room, Sophia watched with a faint curve at her lips. In that moment, Brian realized something. His son was opening a small door into his world, and the first person to step through it wasn't him, but Sophia. That night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Brian sat alone in his study. The yellow pool of his desk lamp spilled over unfinished architectural sketches, but his eyes weren't following a single line. His mind drifted back through the years, to a time when every effort seemed to crash into an invisible wall. He remembered the rushed mornings driving Oliver to speech therapy centers, rooms so white and sterile they smelled of disinfectant. He remembered the unfamiliar faces of specialists, their voices steady as they explained intervention methods, developmental benchmarks, and progress timelines that cost him thousands of dollars each month. He had tried it all: one-on-one therapy, group sessions, speech-assistive devices, even phone apps filled with bright animated pictures. Oliver would engage for a while, then slip back into silence. Each failure drove Brian to work harder, telling himself that if he couldn't heal his son, he could at least give him a life of material comfort. But that was when the distance began to grow. Oliver avoided his gaze, didn't respond when Brian called his name, didn't run to hug him when he returned from business trips. Brian blamed it on his son's emotional trauma, but he never dared to ask whether he had helped build that void himself. Since the day he lost his wife, Brian had chosen avoidance. He stayed at the office late into the night, filled his evenings with meetings that should have been spent at home. Deep down, he knew that somewhere within the cold walls of the penthouse, a boy was growing up in silence, and a father was slowly losing the chance to know his child. Now, with the image of Oliver humming on Sophia's upturned feet still etched in his mind, Brian realized what he had missed. It wasn't a technique or the latest therapy. It was the simplest thing of all: presence. He had been there in body, but never truly there. One weekend evening, Brian came home earlier than usual. The rain had stopped, but the dampness lingered in the air, slipping through the window frames. He took off his coat, walked down the hallway, and paused when he saw the warm yellow lights spilling from the living room. Sophia and Oliver were sitting on the floor, between them a chalkboard covered in pastel colors, surrounded by broken chalk sticks and smudges of dust. Oliver was carefully coloring in a giant hot air balloon, while Sophia added fluffy white clouds around it. Brian leaned against the doorway, watching. Neither of them seemed to notice him. Oliver occasionally looked up, smiling at Sophia, then returned to coloring. For the first time, Brian saw his son hold eye contact with someone for that long. When Oliver's arms grew tired and he ran to the kitchen for water, Brian stepped inside. He gestured toward the drawing. "You're good. He's never—" Sophia looked up, cutting him off with a sad smile. "I'm not better than anyone else. I just know what that feels like." Brian frowned slightly. Sophia set the chalk down and brushed the dust from her hands. Her voice grew quieter. Brian's throat tightened. He remembered the dozens of therapists, the cold clinical words, the endless tests, the piles of insurance paperwork stacked on his desk like constant reminders of failure. He remembered passing by Oliver's room each morning before work, hearing the heavy silence and continuing on, because he didn't know how to break it. "I tried to fix everything with money," he said, the words catching in his throat. "But I never gave him the one thing he needed most. Me?" Sophia nodded without judgment. "But he needed something free." Brian sat down on the imported velvet sofa, his arms cradling Oliver, who was nestled against his chest, peaceful in a way Brian had never seen since the accident. "Why do you care?" he asked. "I once lost a child," she said simply. Brian held his breath. "Not my own," she continued. "I was a live-in nanny for a wealthy family before I came here. The boy's name was Jordan. He had eyes like Oliver's, was afraid of loud noises, and was silent as if crying out for help. His parents didn't believe in patience. They wanted quick results, intensive therapy, experimental drugs. I was fired when I suggested they slow down, let him have time to be a child." Brian stayed silent, feeling as if every word she spoke was exposing something within himself he didn't want to see. Jordan died a year later in a hospital bed, an overdose of the very drugs meant to help him. I wasn't there when he passed. I've never forgiven myself. When I saw your son that first day, standing by the window, staring into nothing, I saw Jordan, and I knew this time I wouldn't walk away. Brian blinked repeatedly to keep the tears from falling. "I don't deserve this moment." Sophia's gaze was steady, not weak, but full of compassion. "Maybe you don't, but he does, and you can still choose to deserve it." Silence filled the room. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something had cracked. Not in Oliver, but in Brian, the steel wall, the emotional armor, the mask of the successful CEO. "I've never been a father," he whispered like a choked sob. "You still have time," she replied softly but firmly. Oliver shifted in his father's arms, looking up with wide, trusting eyes, yawning before snuggling back against his chest, as if there had never been any distance between them. Brian looked at Sophia. For the first time, he no longer saw her as just the housekeeper, but as the woman who had saved his family. "You're not just the one who cleans the house." "I never tried to be anything more than myself," she shrugged, a simple gesture that held quiet dignity. "You brought my son back to me." "I didn't heal him," she said firmly. "I just helped him find himself again. The difference matters." Brian looked at his son, feeling something he hadn't touched in 3 years, not just love, which had always been there beneath the guilt and despair, but hope, clear and real. "Thank you," he said. They were the most sincere words he had spoken in a very long time. Sophia stood, smoothing the front of her jeans. "He needs stability," she said, her tone shifting to practical. "He's still afraid, but not of walking, of being left alone." "I'll be home," Brian said, a promise to her and to himself. "More often, much more." Sophia nodded, but didn't smile. "He'll know if you truly mean it. Children always know." "I mean it." And this time, he truly did. In the days that followed, the house began to fill with new sounds. Not clear words yet, but gentle humming, clumsy whistling, or bursts of laughter when Oliver and Sophia chased each other around the dining table. One Saturday morning, Brian woke to the sound of a guitar. He stepped into the living room to find Sophia sitting on a chair, cradling an acoustic guitar, singing a playful song about fish swimming under the sea. Oliver sat beside her, tapping his hands on his thighs, humming along to the tune. Brian lingered in the doorway, smiling quietly. Another time, while Brian was at his desk working on a design sketch, Oliver quietly walked in. The boy held out a sheet of paper and placed it in front of him. On it was a drawing of 3 figures, Brian, Oliver, and Sophia, standing beneath a blue sky full of birds. Brian stared at the drawing for a long moment, a strange warmth tightening in his chest. "That's beautiful, Oliver," he said softly, knowing his son wouldn't answer. Oliver didn't speak, only pushed the box of crayons toward him, an unspoken invitation. Brian set his pen down, pulled his chair closer, and added a few white clouds beside the birds. Sophia walked past, caught sight of the scene, and smiled. Day by day, Oliver began to seek Brian out more often. Sometimes he would tug his father's hand toward the balcony to point at clouds shaped like strange creatures. Other times, he would sit close while they looked at picture books together. No words were exchanged, but Brian felt the distance between them fade, like morning fog dissolving in sunlight. One afternoon, the three of them sat on the floor building puzzles. Oliver struggled to fit two pieces together. Brian started to reach out, but Sophia subtly motioned for him to wait. The boy tried once, twice, and finally the last piece clicked into place. Oliver looked up, beaming, his eyes alight with pride. Brian realized it was the first time he had seen his son solve a challenge without giving up, and he knew this was a small victory, but a giant step forward. That Sunday morning, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of the penthouse, spilling warm, golden streaks across the floor. Sophia suggested taking Oliver to the Riverside Park, where there was a playground with swings and slides. Brian hesitated. He hadn't taken his son to play outdoors since the day his wife died. But when Oliver heard the word park, his eyes lit up, and his small hand touched Brian's arm like a silent plea. Brian nodded. The park was lively that morning, filled with children's laughter and shouts. Oliver clung tightly to Sophia's hand as they walked in, his eyes scanning the space as if measuring every sound and movement. Brian walked beside them, keeping just enough distance not to overwhelm him. When they reached the swings, Sophia sat down on one seat, placing Oliver on her lap, and gently pushed so they swayed together. The boy smiled faintly, his messy brown hair tossing in the wind. Brian stood nearby, his heartbeat slowing as he heard Oliver hum softly along to the tune Sophia was singing. And then it happened. In the middle of a swing, Oliver looked straight at Brian, his lips parting. A sound slipped out, so fragile Brian thought he imagined it. "Duh?" Brian froze. In that instant, all the noise of the park seemed to vanish, leaving only the pounding of his own heart and the tiny mouth that had just formed a simple but monumental sound. Sophia smiled, leaning in to whisper, "He's ready? But only if you stay." The words struck Brian like an arrow. He understood that stay wasn't just physical presence. It was a commitment to truly be there, not to leave when things got hard. That evening, after tucking Oliver into bed, Brian sat with Sophia in the living room. Without looking at her, he began to speak, his voice low and deliberate. The day of the accident. I was at a construction site out of town. She called me before she drove home. I told her I was busy, that we'd talk another time. That was the last time I heard her voice. He swallowed hard, his hands tightening together. I've tried to make it up to him in every way, except the one that mattered most, being here with Oliver. I thought I was protecting him from pain. In truth, I was protecting myself from feeling helpless. Sophia didn't interrupt. She simply sat there, her deep brown eyes steady, letting him speak. When I heard him today, I knew I couldn't keep running. Sophia gave a small nod. Then don't. Brian looked up, meeting her gaze. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had unlocked a door he'd always kept shut. In the days following that morning at the park, Brian began rearranging his work schedule. He turned down certain projects, cut back on unnecessary meetings, and for the first time in years, he was home regularly before dinner. At first, Oliver still clung more to Sophia, but gradually, the boy began pulling Brian into his games. One afternoon, while Sophia was cooking, Oliver ran over, placed a Lego block in Brian's hand, and gestured for him to help build a tower. Brian hesitated, but sat down, and together they stacked the pieces until the tower nearly touched the table. Oliver grinned wide, his eyes crinkling, and Brian realized he was smiling too. In the evenings, Sophia often brought a small speaker into the living room, playing soft music. One time, when a slow song began, she picked Oliver up and swayed gently to the rhythm. Brian leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, watching. Oliver rested his head on Sophia's shoulder, eyes closed in contentment. Sophia caught Brian's gaze and said softly, "Come here." He was a little surprised but stepped forward. She shifted Oliver naturally into his arms, then placed her hand on his shoulder. Before he could react, he realized the three of them were turning slowly together under the warm light. Oliver opened his eyes, looked at him, then wrapped his arms around his neck. A simple moment, but for Brian, it was the first time he truly felt like he belonged in this picture. Evenings like that became routine. They cooked together, ate together, and spent time with Oliver. Some nights they gathered around the table to draw. Other nights they sat on the balcony to watch the stars. Sophia told fairy tales punctuated with laughter, and Brian noticed that every time she laughed, the room seemed brighter. One night, after Oliver had gone to bed, Brian and Sophia sat on the balcony. The night breeze carried the faint scent of leftover rain. Brian was silent for a long while before saying, "Thank you for being here." Sophia turned to him, her gaze gentle. "I'm here for Oliver." Brian nodded slightly, but in his heart, he knew the reason was no longer just Oliver. That afternoon, the rain returned. Not the usual downpour of Seattle, but a light, steady drizzle, each drop sliding slowly down the glass windows. In the living room, Brian sat on the couch with Oliver leaning against him, the two of them looking through a picture book about birds. Sophia sat across from them, a cup of hot tea in her hands, watching in quiet. Brian pointed to an illustration of a swallow with its wings spread wide and asked softly, "Isn't it beautiful?" Oliver looked at the picture for a moment, then turned to Sophia. She smiled and nodded, as if encouraging him to respond in his own way. Oliver touched the page with his finger, and then, unexpectedly, his lips moved. A sound came out, no longer just a hum or a vague murmur, but clear and whole. "Mom." Brian froze, his heart tightened, as if something was gripping it from the inside. Sophia set her cup down, her eyes widening, her lips trembling slightly. "You just—" Brian couldn't finish, his throat closing up. Oliver kept looking at the picture, but his small hand pressed against Brian's chest, as if to make sure he was really there, truly there. Tears spilled, hot against Brian's cheeks. The word Mom wasn't just a call to the mother he had lost, it was a bridge built from silence to trust, from loneliness to belonging. In that single word, Oliver told him, "I'm not alone anymore." Sophia sat down beside them, wrapping her arms around them both. No one spoke. The rain outside mingled with the warmth between the three of them, softening the emptiness that had once filled their past. That night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, the house settled into a strange kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence it once knew, but a gentle pause, like the moment before a new chapter begins. Brian found himself replaying the day, Oliver's voice, Sophia's steady presence, and realizing that somewhere along the way, she had become part of his home, not just the one who worked in it. Brian stood in the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of wine. He carried one out to the balcony where Sophia was standing, her eyes fixed on the distant city lights. She took the glass, offering a soft smile of thanks. "Today?" "Thank you." Brian began, his voice low but steady. "Not just because Oliver spoke, but because you brought him back. And you brought me back too." Sophia turned toward him, her gaze seeming to ask for more, but she said nothing. Brian drew a deep breath, his fingers circling the stem of the glass. "Before you came, I thought all I needed to do was provide enough money, enough comfort, and things would be fine. But you showed me. Presence is what matters most. And you've been present not just for Oliver, but for me too." Sophia stayed silent, her eyes glistening, the corners of her mouth curving in a smile that looked fragile, as if it might disappear. Brian set his glass down on the small table beside them. He looked straight at her. "Sophia, I love you, and I don't want this to end when your contract is up." She froze for a moment, and Brian stepped closer. "I want us to be a family, not just on paper, But for real, will you marry me?" The night breeze carried a chill, but between them there was only warmth. Sophia gave a small laugh, tears slipping free but her eyes shining. "Are you sure? This isn't just about Oliver?" Brian shook his head without hesitation. "This is about us. All three of us." Sophia nodded, her smile spreading wide through the tears. "Then, I say yes." Brian took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Somewhere in the apartment, Oliver shifted in his sleep, utterly at peace. The wedding took place on a gentle autumn afternoon. Golden sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering dappled light across the lawn, where a small, intimate ceremony had been set up, attended only by family and close friends. Sophia wore a simple yet elegant white dress, her hair loosely tied back, her face radiant. Brian stood beside her in a navy suit, his gaze never leaving her for even a moment. Oliver was the only little groomsman. He wore a crisp white shirt with a small blue bow tie that matched Brian's suit. From the start of the ceremony, Oliver darted between Brian and Sophia, holding their hands, giggling all the while. When the officiant finished the declaration, Brian and Sophia turned to share their first kiss as husband and wife. At that very moment, Oliver suddenly stepped between them, grinning wide, clapping his hands, and shouting loud and clear for everyone in the garden to hear. "I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad." For a second, everyone froze. Then laughter and applause erupted. Brian and Sophia bent down, wrapping their arms tightly around him. Tears rolled down their cheeks, not just for the joy of today, but for the long journey that had led them to this moment. After the wedding, life moved forward in a warm, simple rhythm. Sunday mornings meant pancakes in the kitchen. Weekday evenings were filled with laughter over board games. Oliver, once a quiet boy, had become a little bell ringing all day long. He told stories at the dinner table, sang in the bath, and asked endless questions. Brian still marveled each time he heard his son speak in full, excited sentences about a bird he'd spotted or a cloud shaped like something from his imagination. And sometimes, when Sophia was in the living room, Oliver would run over, tug her hand, and say, "Mom, airplane." Sophia would laugh, lie down on the floor, and lift him into the air with her legs, just like the first day they met. Oliver would spread his arms, tilt his face toward the ceiling, and hum the song about airplanes and the sky, his voice full of freedom and joy. Brian often sat in his chair watching, his heart overflowing with gratitude for this simple, precious moment. One spring morning, Sophia placed a pregnancy test with 2 red lines into Brian's hand. He stared for a moment, then lifted her into his arms and spun her around the kitchen, their laughter echoing through the apartment. When they told Oliver he was going to be a big brother, he jumped up and shouted, "I'm going to be a big brother." From that day on, every night before bed, Oliver would pick a storybook, sit beside Sophia, press his cheek to her belly, and read aloud to the baby. Some nights it was about airplanes, other nights about migrating birds. Sophia would run her fingers through his hair, her eyes shining, while Brian leaned in the doorway, smiling quietly. The house was no longer a museum of silence as it had once been. It was now a stage for laughter, a place where small songs played every evening, a sky where Oliver once dreamed of flying, and now the whole family was flying together. By the next summer, their home echoed with a new sound, the first cry of a baby girl. Sophia had given birth on a bright morning, and Brian's eyes had filled with tears as he held her for the first time. They named her Amelia, meaning lover of the sky, a quiet tribute to the day Oliver had lain across Sophia's legs, humming the song about airplanes and the sky. Oliver, now 6 years old, embraced his role as big brother with a pride Brian had never seen before. He wanted to be near her at all times, even when Amelia was asleep. He would bring stuffed animals to her crib, adjust her blanket when she stirred, and every night before bed he pressed his cheek against Sophia's belly, telling stories to her even before she was born. The very first song Amelia ever heard wasn't a lullaby. It was the same airplane and sky song Sophia had once sung to Oliver. Now Oliver was the one singing it, his voice sometimes soaring with excitement, sometimes soft and tender as if cradling the whole sky. Sophia would sit quietly, listening, her eyes shimmering with a happiness words could barely touch. One early autumn afternoon, Brian suggested, "How about a picnic? On that grassy hill near the small airport. I used to go there as a kid to watch the planes take off." Sophia agreed instantly. They packed a large basket, sandwiches Brian made, fruit Sophia had sliced, and a brand new kite Oliver had been waiting to try. When they arrived, the sky was so blue it felt within reach. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. They spread a blanket beneath an old oak tree, Amelia sleeping peacefully in Sophia's arms while Brian helped Oliver launch the kite. Within minutes, the blue kite soared high, dancing with the wind. Oliver shouted, "Look, it's flying so high!" His laughter mingled with the wind and the low rumble of a small plane taking off nearby. Brian looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest, then turned to see Sophia smiling too, her eyes reflecting the image of father and son framed against the wide sky. When the kite reached its highest point, Oliver turned and ran toward Sophia, cheeks flushed. "Mom! Dad! Airplane!" Sophia laughed, lying back on the blanket and signaling for him to come closer. Then, in what had become their secret family ritual, Oliver lay back across her legs. Sophia lifted him into the air, balancing him as if he were flying. Oliver spread his arms wide, closed his eyes, and began to sing the familiar song, the same song that had first broken the wall of silence between him and the world. Brian brought Amelia close, sat beside them, kissed Sophia's forehead, and whispered, "This is our sky." Oliver's laughter rang out, his voice blending with the distant hum of the airplane above. And in that instant, Brian knew. From a boy who once spoke no words, Oliver had become the loudest voice in his life, the voice of trust, of presence, and of love. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amelia awoke, her wide eyes blinking at the world as if trying to memorize this happy evening. Brian wrapped Sophia, Oliver, and Amelia in his arms, his heart as calm as if it had never known loss. "It doesn't matter where we are. As long as we're together, we've already touched the sky," Brian said softly. Oliver looked up at him, grinning wide. Sophia squeezed Brian's hand, and Amelia made a soft, contented sound, as if agreeing. And Brian knew their journey didn't end here. It would go on, like endless flights, across the private sky they had built together. The story of Brian, Sophia, and Oliver reminds us that sometimes miracles don't come from faraway places, nor do they require expensive methods or grand promises. The real miracle comes from presence, from pausing, listening, and loving each other enough to bridge any distance. From a boy who once spoke no words, Oliver found his voice again, not only in sentences, but in laughter, songs, and the moments he flew on his mother's legs. From a man who once avoided, Brian learned how to be a father, a husband, and part of a real family. They touched the sky, not with airplane wings, but with the wings of love and trust. And if this story has touched your heart, remember, somewhere out there, your own sky is waiting for you to open your arms and embrace it.